It all began with a casual conversation, a sentence that caught me completely off guard. "Next month, my sister will start living with us. Can you give up your room?" Ken said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood there in silence, utterly confused. We had never discussed this before. Why would his sister suddenly need to move in with us? My heart raced, my mind filled with questions, but I couldn't find the words to respond. The room felt colder than usual as Ken turned away, leaving the door half open. What he didn't realize was that his sister, Susan, was sitting quietly in the room, just as shocked as I was. Her eyes met mine, wide and bewildered. Clearly, she had no idea about this plan either. In that brief moment, I knew something wasn't right. My mind raced to figure out what Ken was really up to. What was happening behind my back? Susan shifted awkwardly in her seat, and I forced a smile. "It's fine," I said, though my thoughts were anything but. Inside, a storm of emotions brewed: confusion, hurt, and anger. Ken had always been a little distant, but lately it felt like he was keeping secrets. I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. Why would he ask me to give up my room without even talking to me first? And why hadn't he told Susan? This wasn't like him, or at least it wasn't like the man I thought I had married. With my pulse racing, I turned back to Ken, who was already walking away, as if the conversation was over. But it wasn't over, not by a long shot. I made a decision in that moment. I would no longer stay silent. I would get to the bottom of whatever was happening, even if it meant unraveling the very fabric of my marriage. I glanced at Susan again, her expression mirroring my own confusion. Something was definitely wrong. As soon as Ken left the room, I gathered my thoughts and turned to Susan. She looked as puzzled as I felt, and I knew I had to address the elephant in the room. "Did you know about this?" I asked her, hoping for some clarity. Susan shook her head, clearly as much in the dark as I was. "No, I didn't. Ken never mentioned anything to me about moving in." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. If Susan wasn't aware of this plan, then what exactly was Ken thinking? My mind spun with possibilities, none of them comforting. Was this about something more than just his sister needing a place to stay? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about the way Ken had brought it up, so casually and without care for my opinion, made my stomach churn. And Susan's confusion only added to the unsettling feeling that there was something I wasn't seeing. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. I needed to confront Ken, but I wasn't sure how to begin. All I knew was that I couldn't ignore this any longer. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. Ken had come home late, smelling of alcohol, and went straight to bed without saying a word. His silence gnawed at me. Over the past few months, his behavior had shifted, little by little. At first, it was subtle, working late more often, spending weekends away with vague explanations, avoiding conversations about his day. But now, it was undeniable. He was hiding something. My heart pounded as I recalled the way he'd dismissed me earlier, casually dropping the bombshell about Susan moving in as though it was a minor detail. And then there was the look on Susan's face. She had no idea what was happening either. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ken was using her as a cover for something else, something far more sinister. I had to know the truth. As I lay there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I made up my mind. Tomorrow, I would start digging. Whatever Ken was hiding, I would uncover it. The next day, while Ken was at work, I started my search. I went through his office, checking drawers, files, and his desk for anything that might give me a clue. My hands trembled with a mixture of fear and determination as I sifted through papers and documents. For the most part, everything seemed ordinary: work contracts, bills, random notes. But then I found something that made my heart skip a beat. It was a receipt from a restaurant I had never heard of, dated from 2 weeks ago. He hadn't mentioned going out that night, and the timestamp showed he had been there late, well past his supposed work hours. My mind raced. Could he have been there with someone else? The idea of him hiding a secret life from me seemed absurd, but the evidence was starting to pile up. I took a photo of the receipt with my phone for safekeeping. This wasn't enough to confront him with, but it was a start. I had to be careful. If I was going to find out the truth, I couldn't tip my hand too soon. As days passed, I kept a close eye on Ken, looking for any signs that might reveal more about his strange behavior. He continued coming home late, logically, always with an excuse that felt increasingly rehearsed. Every time he spoke, my stomach turned, knowing I couldn't trust a word he said. But it was Susan who unexpectedly became my ally. One evening, she called me out of the blue, her voice quiet and hesitant. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she began, "but something's been bothering me." My heart raced as I listened. Susan explained that she had overheard Ken on the phone, talking in hushed tones with someone, a woman. He hadn't mentioned her by name, but the way he spoke was too intimate to ignore. "I didn't want to jump to conclusions," Susan said, "but I thought you should know." Her words sent a chill down my spine. It was one thing to suspect Ken of being distant or secretive, but hearing it confirmed by his own sister made it feel real, undeniable. The walls were closing in, and I realized I couldn't avoid confronting him any longer. That night, I decided to confront Ken. When he finally came home, well after midnight, I was waiting for him in the living room. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and anger bubbling just below the surface. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Ken looked at me, surprised, but quickly masked it with his usual nonchalance. "About what?" he asked, trying to brush me off. But this time, I wasn't going to let him dodge the conversation. I took out my phone and showed him the picture of the receipt I had found. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. His face changed instantly, the color draining from his cheeks. He stammered, searching for an excuse, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew he was caught. "It's not what you think," he began, but I cut him off. "Then what is it, Ken? Because it looks like you've been lying to me for months." The air between us felt heavy with unspoken truths, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. Ken's voice cracked as he tried to explain himself. He mumbled something about work stress, about needing to unwind, but none of it made sense. I could see the lies unraveling before me, each word more desperate than the last. My chest tightened with a mix of heartbreak and fury. I had given him the benefit of the doubt for too long, and now I was done. "Who were you with that night?" I demanded, my voice rising. Ken hesitated for a split second, just long enough for me to know the answer. "It's not what you think," he repeated, but his eyes betrayed him. There was someone else. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt my world shift beneath me. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about Ken, was a lie. I turned away, unable to look at him. My mind raced, trying to process the betrayal. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw him out of the house, but instead I took a deep breath and steeled myself. "We're done," I said quietly, the words falling from my lips with a finality that surprised even me. Ken looked at me, stunned. "What do you mean, we're done?" he asked, his voice shaking. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me. "I mean, I'm filing for a divorce?" I said, louder this time. The look of shock on his face was almost satisfying, but the pain in my chest dulled any sense of victory. Ken stumbled backward as if the word divorce had physically knocked him off balance. "You can't be serious," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. But I was serious, more serious than I had ever been in my life. "You've been lying to me for months," I said, my voice breaking. "I trusted you, and you threw it all away." The room felt heavy with the weight of the truth, and Ken, for once, didn't have a snappy comeback. He just stood there, pale and silent, as the reality of our crumbling marriage sank in. I walked past him, grabbing my phone as I headed toward the bedroom. "I'll be packing my things tomorrow," I said over my shoulder. "You should probably figure out where you'll be staying." The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. Ken had left early, probably to avoid facing the reality of our impending separation. As I packed my belongings, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The uncertainty, the lies, the constant feeling that something was wrong, all of it was coming to an end. But as I moved from room to room, gathering my things, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Ken's affair, his lies, it all felt like just the tip of the iceberg. I found myself wondering if there was something even darker lurking beneath the surface. My phone buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. It was Susan. "I'm coming over," her text read. My heart raced as I quickly typed back, "Okay." When Susan arrived, her face was pale, and I could tell she had something important to tell me. "I looked into Ken's behavior at work," she said as we sat down in the kitchen. My stomach dropped. Whatever she had found, it wasn't good. "Lisa," she began. Zrenia, her voice trembling. "Ken's been having an affair with someone at the company." I stared at Susan, the words sinking in like a slow-acting poison. I had suspected the affair for weeks, but hearing it confirmed felt like a fresh wound. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Susan hesitated for a moment, then said, "A new employee, someone from a different department." I didn't want to believe it, but I saw the security footage. They were having lunch together, sharing food, and more. My breath caught in my throat. Ken had been living a double life right under my nose, and the entire time, he had used Susan's potential move-in as a cover to further his betrayal. "I'm so sorry, Lisa," Susan said, tears welling in her eyes. "I never imagined my brother would do something like this." I shook my head, unable to speak. The anger, the betrayal, the sadness, it was all too much to process. "It's not your fault," I managed to say. But I couldn't shake the thought that everyone around me had known more about my own husband than I did. I felt utterly alone, even as Susan reached across the table to hold my hand. With Susan's support, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait any longer. I called a moving company that same day, arranging for my things to be packed and taken to a storage unit. When Ken came home that evening, the movers were already there, loading boxes into the truck. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice panicked as he saw the scene unfolding. I turned to face him, my heart cold and unyielding. "I told you, Ken," I said, my voice steady. "We're done. I'm moving out, and I'm filing for a divorce." His face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought he might try to stop me. But then, as if realizing there was nothing left to fight for, he simply nodded. "I'll sign the papers," he said quietly. As the last of my belongings were loaded into the truck, I felt a strange sense of peace. It was over. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal, it was all behind me now, and for the first time in months, I felt free. As I climbed into my car and drove away from the life I once knew, I couldn't help but smile. A new chapter awaited me, one where I could finally reclaim my life.